We'll do it live.
Okay.
We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irita TV here today doing it live. It is Wednesday, January 11th, 2023, and we are here to continue the topic of analyzing the world from the perspective of Peter Zeihan, which, as we've done a couple previous shows, we agree and disagree on a lot of things. But today we're going to be going over the world of energy, and I'm going to have a feeling we agree more than we disagree here. So Nima has been plotting his way through Peter Zeihan's book, which is The End is Just the Beginning. That's the name of the book? No? What's the name of the damn book?
The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
I was close.
Yes.
I was close. If you typed that into Amazon, you would have found it. So we've gotten to the energy chapter, and I think this is going to be a fascinating continuation of the conversation of what exactly is happening to globalism as we speak, and oil is a big thing to do with it, not only from the fact that it's important, but the entire Western world has a hard-on for trying to make it go away, and it's not really going away, as we'll see. So Nima, can you start us off by giving a broad overview of what we're talking about and what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so we went through transport and finance in the past few episodes, I think, and the history of geopolitics, transport, finance, and the next chapter is energy. So obviously the transport issues are the US is not going to patrol transport anymore. Financial demographic issues are there's not going to be a lot of high income earning savers who can invest money in stocks, etc. So finance we talked about how, banking and finance could totally deal with that issue through the lens of MMT. And then the next chapter he gets into is energy. So he starts by he starts with an example of an oil field called Kashagan, or Kashagan. I don't know if you've heard about that, but
where is it?
It's in Kazakhstan, and he illustrates how insane that whole Kashagan project is, because the way it has to be extracted and then transported, etc., would not be possible in a world where America doesn't patrol the oceans.
Well, to that point, I mean, I've actually been listening about this sort of stuff on a show other than Peter Zeihan's. I think it's Wendover Productions is the one that I listen to occasionally. That area of the world specifically, that the Central Asian area, they're starting to find a lot of oil, and there's a big issue in how the hell they're actually going to get it anywhere.
Yeah.
So, leveraging off of that, please continue.
So here, once Kashagan's crude is pumped up, depressurized, and processed, it is piped more than 1,000 miles to the Black Sea, where it is loaded into small tankers for transit through the Turkish Straits to the Mediterranean, passing through downtown Istanbul before sailing on through the Suez Canal to the Red Sea. It is then loaded onto long-haul supertankers that transport the crude another 8,000 miles past Pakistan and India through the Strait of Malacca, which is where Singapore is, and by the entirety of the Vietnamese and Chinese coasts before reaching its final destination in Japan. It's a dicey route. Kazakhstan is a former province of Russia, and the two do not get along. Turkey has fought 11 major wars with Russia, and they do not get along. Egypt is a former province of Turkey, and they do not get along. Saudi Arabia considers Kazakhstan an economic competitor, and they do not get along. The route passes by Pakistan and India, who do not get along, and Vietnam and China, who do not get along, and China and Japan, who do not get along. Oh, and there are pirates in the Red Sea and Malacca as well. Kashagan's export route is bar none the world's riskiest. And he says this will not last, basically. And also, he talks about how a lot of this extraction in Kashagan required foreign skills, equipment, knowledge, workers, managers, etc. And those are now withdrawing from the region.
Because of the Russian conflict.
Right. So, just one example of how this will not last. But then he goes into the history of oil. The first oil was whale oil that was used to...
Before you get into that history, I think it's worth emphasizing, if you listen to the other show about the transport, this would have been clear, but Nima pointed out that as soon as the United States stops patrolling the oceans, this becomes a big issue. And right now, because the United States is patrolling the oceans, these tankers can pass by these choke points. I mean, it's just choke point after choke point after choke point after choke point, passing countries that don't like each other, and none of the countries do anything about it because the U.S. is patrolling the ocean. Well, if the U.S. stops patrolling the oceans and these regional players can start fighting over this, I mean, like, how many hostile areas does that oil have to go past unmolested to get to its final destination? Is the point that he's making here. And if the U.S. stops patrolling the oceans, more than likely at least one of those players might go, you know what, yoink.
Yeah.
Considering
that he says here, whenever I consider the history and mechanics and export routes of Kashagan, all I can think is, what the hell? The bewildering Frankensteinian monster that is Kashagan and its export route could only occur under the aegis of the Order. The Order has made everything so peaceable and stable and wealthy for so long that production and transport systems that would have been considered several steps beyond asinine in any other age are well within reach.
So go back to whale oil. I want to hear about whale oil.
Yeah, so this is about the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The Brits are producing textiles. They want to expand their working hours. And so they started using whale oil for lamps. So they started hunting whales, basically clearing the oceans of whales in their regions. Yeah, I mean, don't need to talk about whale oil much more, I don't think. But the solution, there was a solution to, oh, sorry, what was the...
whale oil, there was this demand for whale oil that I'm guessing got replaced by kerosene. Is that how this story is going to unfold?
Yeah. Well, so he says in 1858, one Edwin Drake applied some railway engine parts to a vertical drill outside of Titusville, Pennsylvania. Within a few weeks, the world's first ever oil well was producing more crude oil in a couple of hours than most seeps would in a year. So they had these little seeps at one point where they could extract, you know, a little bit of oil here and there. But then through this application of equipment in 1958 in Pennsylvania, this was probably really the beginning of oil becoming the engine of the industrialized economy. And then he talks about the last place.
Fun.
Then
I got a fun. Oh, go for it. When you're looking again, I got a fun fact about.
Well, yeah, he talks about the importance of oil for all these different countries and all the wars fought over oil, like including the Germans were trying to get because actually, oh, this was funny for the Game of Thrones fans here. Humanity had known about crude oil seeps since ancient times. The Byzantines used such oil sources to make a party favor known as Greek fire for their enemies, while the Zoroastrians preferred to light the seeps on fire to ensure the party never ended. The problem was volume. Such seeps rarely generated more than a few quarters of the stuff. And then he goes into how we struck these major oil wells using equipment in Pennsylvania. That was the beginning, I guess, of what you could call the industrial... well, Industrial Revolution had already begun in the 1770s. But in the US, it started later, right? The US, it started only like in around that time, actually. Then the real miracle arrived. We started applying material science expertise we had only recently gained from tinkering with coal to this new world of oil. It wasn't long before whale oil replacement kerosene showed us the way to wind power replacement fuel oil and horse replacement gasoline. Wasn't long in relative terms, of course. And they kept on using whale oil for a little while.
Well, I want to say the fun fact. So when they were mostly interested in the kerosene, which was at the beginning because it was the replacement for the whale oil, when you distill a barrel of oil, you get methane and ethane and propane and gasoline and naphtha and kerosene and diesel and tar at the bottom. Like there's out of that barrel of oil, there's only so much kerosene. And my understanding of what they used to do with the gas, they just burn it. They would just put it in a pit and let it evaporate or burn it because they had no idea what to do with the gasoline. They had no use for it.
Gasoline or gas?
Gasoline.
Oh, you mean the gasoline components of the oil that are now used for gasoline? Back then they had.
Well, I mean, there's something called straight run gas. I used to work at an oil refinery, by the way. There's something called straight run gas, which if you distill out the gasoline, like off the top, you get the gases, right? The stuff that floats in the air, propane and such, right? Right below that, you get what's called straight run gasoline, which isn't that great for gas. It's probably got an octane somewhere in the 70s. You got to get it up to the 90s for it to be any good. It's got an octane somewhere in the 70s, and that's used when you have all your gasoline components, because by the time you get to the end of the refinery process, you'll end up with 4 or 5 different gasoline components, and there's a guy whose job it is to mix those components so A, you get a good product, and B, you don't have any waste left over. And the straight run is kind of a filler because the octane rating's so low. So at the beginning, before they had cars, they didn't know what to do with this straight run gasoline. They would just let it evaporate and burn it.
So, by the way, these northern seeps of Zoroastrian lands, that's what we today know as Azerbaijan. So they were they were in Russian hands in the 1900s, yeah. Soviet Union. And then south, the Persians, there was obviously the Brits got involved with their explorations. The commonality of these early decades of the oil era were simple. Either you had oil and so could field modern military gear, compete with the insane speed and range and striking power granted, or you were on horseback. Thus, oil production sites were among the world's most jealously guarded locations, and everyone kept their oil in-house. The last point was key. Each country had its own major oil company. Compagnie Française de Pétrole for France, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for the UK, Standard Oil for the US, and so on. We know them today as Total, BP, and ExxonMobil. Or Total, or how do you say it in French? I don't know. Total, BP, ExxonMobil. So their first and foremost responsibility was to fuel the home front. And that's also, he says, why the Germans made a push eastward. The Germans' desperate bid for those old Zoroastrian assets in Soviet Azerbaijan, founded at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 through 43, while the Americans bombed Romanian oil fields in August 1943 to deny the Nazis their output. Also, the Japanese successfully captured Java in 1942 to acquire Dutch oil resources. So it was like a hot commodity during World War II, for sure.
Well, and I think that's kind of the story of the Axis powers, is they didn't have their own oil, and all the Allied powers did. And I mean, maybe it's too simple to say that's why the war was won or lost, but I think that was a major contributing factor.
That's an interesting observation. And then after the war was over, the Americans basically changed this regionalized oil system, where I think it even had different prices, right? The French had their own sphere, the Dutch had their own sphere, the Brits had their own, the American had their own. The Americans after World War II, now with the military across the ocean, etc., they rewired the world at war's end and changed everything. Oil was no exception. Americans killed the imperial age, is what he says, which is, I guess, true. the final vestiges of the old empires was basically gone after World War II for the most part. The big empires through, I guess, post-Renaissance, we still had empires. We had the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the French Empire.
Ottoman.
The Ottoman.
I mean, they fell in World War I, but yeah.
Exactly. So a bigger piece of it was the same economics for security trade that drove most of the American strategic calculus. The American plan to contain the Soviets required allies. Those allies had to be purchased with the promise of economic access and growth, and that access and growth needed to be fueled, and the fuel could only be sourced from so many locations. All of a sudden, instead of British oil and Dutch oil and French oil, there was only global oil, as guaranteed by the US Navy. Any crude could now reach any buyer. All the varied sequester pricing models collapsed into a single global price, modified only by distance and the specific chemical peculiarities of the crude from this or that field. Oil immediately became tangled up in the new strategic environment. Known energy producers such as Persia and the Dutch East Indies gained a new lease on life, becoming the independent countries we now know as Iran and Indonesia. Budding energy producers that were technically independent, but in reality were half foreign managed, think Iraq and Saudi Arabia, were allowed to come into their own. Somewhat unsurprisingly, some European countries resisted decolonization, but the Americans proved uncharacteristically patient and would often wait until revolutionary movements within the colonies reached critical mass before pressuring their allies, or until the ebb and flow of bilateral relations provided an opening. Thus, countries as diverse as Nigeria, 1960, the Arab Emirates in 1971 received independence from the UK, Algeria in 1962 from France, and Angola from Portugal in 1975. I think that's interesting that he points out that all these independence movements were basically driven ultimately by oil and came out of pressure from the United States, apparently.
Right, and apparently interestingly, it points out our level of patience, where it's like, okay, we know at some point there's going to be an issue, and we'll take advantage of it when it arises.
Right, and and of course these revolutions they happen naturally in all these countries, right? The U.S. never gets involved, manipulates, and
never.
CIA.
That never happens. But before you continue, there's one thing I also want to add. Again, this is me putting my oil refinery hat back on. Is a lot of people don't recognize what oil can make, like, or what could be made out of oil, because typically people think of, like, okay, there's gasoline, propane, maybe jet fuel, maybe diesel, right? And they think of it mostly as fuel, which, I mean, admittedly, most of oil that gets refined turns into fuel, but a lot of people don't realize, did you know that asphalt is oil? Like, roads are literally made out of oil. Yeah, they mix some rocks in there with it, but you're walking over frickin' oil. Almost all chemicals are made from oil, and when you think about, for example, Germany, which is like this hub of chemical manufacturing, that's all made out of oil, right? Bunker fuel, major big ships, like ships that haul oil, for example, they run on this stuff called bunker fuel, which is, if you mentioned it in the book. Again, if you look at the various distillates that come out of the initial crude tower when you distill oil, the bottom you get this tarry nasty stuff, and that tarry nasty stuff can be burnt as fuel for these bunker ships. So I mean, this is saying nothing about plastics, saying nothing about rubber, tires, all the stuff that comes directly from oil as a raw resource. It's really quickly to see, like, this is used for everything that makes any nation modern. Everything, not just fuel. I just wanted to emphasize that.
Right, it's a vital component. As much as the Bretton Woods order demanded that the Americans build, safeguard, and expand that oil market, it was the outcomes of Bretton Woods that made the process exhausting. So he talks about how the Bretton Woods has enabled this global trade, which has produced this incredible boom, which has in turn created huge demand for oil, to the point where by the early 1970s, economic growth back at home had reached the point that America's own energy demands outstripped its production capacity. Not only could the Americans no longer fuel their allies, but they couldn't even fuel themselves. In many ways, it was the same problem that ultimately gutted the gold standard. Success begot use, begot more success, begot more use, begot failure. The Arab oil embargoes of 1973 and 1979 turned what had until then been a hypothetical discussion in America into brass tacks. And so without, so then that's also why Americans and the Brits got involved in Iran, sponsoring a coup in Iran in 1953 to overthrow a semi-democratic system in favor of reinstituting the Shah's full authoritarian powers. American actions included supporting of a borderline genocidal purge in Indonesia of communist elements in 65 through 66, courtesy of Heinz Kissinger, I think. American actions included the quiet backing of an authoritarian Mexican government against pro-democracy forces in 1968. American actions included the largest American expeditionary military action since World War II as part of the forcible ejection of Iraqi troops from Kuwait in 1992. Yeah, so I think that's something that's still, that's something that I remember happening on TV. Mm-hmm. And of course, what was going on at that time was that a former province of Iraq called Kuwait, actually it was part of Iraq, literally part of Iraq. They were drilling, according to Saddam Hussein, they were drilling vertically into Iraqi oil fields. So
they were drilling vertically into, or horizontally?
Sorry, horizontally.
Okay, yeah. But you couldn't drill horizontally back then, right? Isn't that modern?
So maybe it was more like a slanted drill.
Okay.
I don't know. Was it? Because the modern, that was a shale revolution.
You're sticking your straw into my milkshake. Yeah. Okay.
Although actually, doesn't he say that this Edwin Drake applied some railway engine to vertical drill? Okay, yeah, you're right. With the end of the Cold War, the interconnections so that was Kuwait 1992. That also happened to be the end of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, the interconnections of the Bretton Woods system were applied even more broadly, with the Americans deliberately, methodically, unrelentingly expanding the scope of oil availability. The Russian pro-Soviet economic collapse hit Russian industry far harder than Russian oil production, with the surplus output reaching global markets. American firms entered former Soviet republics, most notably Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, to bring ever larger volumes of crude to the world. As always, the focus was on diversity and security of supply, leading the Clinton administration to push for circuitous pipeline routes to bring as much of the new flows to the global market as possible without utilizing Russian territory. So, throughout the entire period of 1945 on, the process earned the Americans no small amount of umbrage from nearly everyone. The Europeans resented losing their colonies. The newly freed colonies disliked American efforts to corral them into a bloc to contain a country, the Soviet Union, that few had any previous contacts with. The Arab world didn't appreciate the Americans forcing their energy cog into the Bretton Woods machine, much less attempting to make them bedfellows with the Israelis. The Mexicans begrudged Washington's heavy-handed approach. The post-Soviet Russians hated how the Americans expressly worked to undermine their influence in their own backyard.
This is all just kind of confirming the stereotype of America that we just, stomp around the earth looking for oil, right?
Right. The Iranians really didn't appreciate the coup. So, yeah.
Really? Why not?
I guess they weren't into it. I don't know. Yeah. But the scale simply kept increasing. At the dawn of the Bretton Woods era, the entire alliance used under 10 million barrels per day. But that's excluding the United States. The majority of which was sourced from the United States itself. Blah, blah, blah. Prices, so then you had China also using more and more oil. You had this whole economic growth. Everyone could share in this, right? It could be shipped everywhere. So prices hit their historical high of $150 a barrel in 2008, a 15-fold increase from just a decade earlier, even as global demand topped 85 million barrels per day. What had begun as an effort to subsidize a military alliance with American crude had devolved into a bloated, unsustainable, and above all expensive mess that the Americans themselves were now economically dependent upon. With the Cold War's end, the Americans may have wanted to take a less active role in global affairs. They may have wanted to disengage, but a single global oil price meant that doing so would risk instability, supply shortages, and oil prices so high as to wreck the American economy. The Americans had become economically trapped in their own outdated security policy.
So why don't we just drill our own fucking oil?
That's what we'll get to.
Okay.
Actually, we get into that in a little bit, but yeah, that's the shale oil revolution changed the game significantly. And this is very recent. This, I think, started in 2006 or so. But then he goes into the map of oil. So he talks about the three major regions of oil production. The first one being the Persian Gulf, the most important one. And by the way, not just oil, but also always natural gas as well. Company. So this is from the Portuguese. From the time the Portuguese were able to shoot their way into India in the early 1500s, the need to pass through or stop in the region more or less evaporated, and the entirety of the Middle East from Egypt to Persia more or less slid into strategic irrelevance. So this was before oil was important, right? So before oil was important, this region wasn't relevant at all. Then enter Brits going into Persia, discovering oil territories in Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates.
Bahrain. You like that pronunciation? Bahrain.
While evolutions and manipulations, both market and military, have varied these players' individual output widely over the years, their collective output has been fairly reliable, 20 million barrels per day for the past 7 decades. So about 20 million barrels per day is exported from the Middle East. These 8 countries have 2 things in common. First, they are technologically incompetent, or at the very best, criminally lazy.
Wait, and then which countries are we talking about? Which 8?
The Persian Gulf.
Okay, got it. They're very lazy and technically incompetent. Is that the insult being hurled here?
Well, he says at the very best they're criminally lazy, but he says technologically incompetent. Their educational systems are sad jokes, and local citizens lucky enough to gain technical degrees out of region tend not to return. The locals' incompetence is hardly limited to the energy sector. These countries, as a matter of course, import millions of foreign workers, so they don't even hire their own people to work these things. Right? They have lots of people from all over the world.
I've heard that I think it's Dubai has something like 200,000 citizens and 2 million people. Like literally 90% of the population of Dubai is imported workers.
Yeah. A lot of people coming in from Philippines, Pakistan,
Indonesia, stuff like that. Yeah.
To handle everything. All 8 countries rely on outside workers, primarily from the US, UK, France, Russia, Turkey, Algeria, and Egypt, to keep the crude flowing. So that's the management class, right? The region doesn't need all of these foreign players, but each in-region country at least needs one of them. So that's the.
So we're setting the world stage, right? These are the dominoes set up that are looking like they're about to fall.
Yeah. So this is. For more than half of those exports, that means so a lot of those exports have to reach the Northeast Asian states of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. For half of the remainder, it means reaching Europe and North America. The order may not have been possible without these countries' oil, but neither would these countries have been possible without the strategic overwatch of the order. So,
and another side thing, it's not really a side thing, but something that came to my mind. I've noticed this since we did our original conversations on the evolution of civilizations. We were talking about the matrix of civilizations, kind of looking at the Afro-Eurasian continent in the sense of like where could people walk at the time, and I mean, from the Sahara Desert north, people could walk there over Suez, right, from Europe or from Asia, using Lebanon and the Syria area, right? That. Due to the accident of geography, the Afro-Eurasian landmass is freaking crazy. It is nothing but choke points and massive amounts of land that have like no access to anything. Like we're talking about with Kazakhstan, right? Like there's this incredibly bizarre way to get this oil out of Kazakhstan to Japan that goes through 37 different choke points with hostile nations guarding each one, right? Like I feel like the entire Afro-Eurasian continent is it's like God designed it so everyone would be fighting on it just because there's so many choke points. When you compare that to the U.S. or just North America in general, we don't have any of those choke points. Nothing.
Yeah.
That thing's tiny. Can you zoom in?
Yeah. I guess not. I guess not.
Yeah.
I just zoomed, but it's not getting larger. It's 200. It says 200%.
Oh. Okay. Well, there's the world map, tiny as it is. But yeah, I mean,
That's what Dylan was talking about.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just assessing the fact that like the whole Afro-Eurasian continent is set up for this mess that we're describing.
Right. The second major zone of oil production is the former Soviet space. So that's Azerbaijan, I guess, Kazakhstan, Russia itself, obviously. While this region's politics and geopolitics are, if anything, louder and messier and heftier than the Persian Gulfs, the calculus of the region's oil is far simpler. The Soviet Union was a massive producer of the black stuff, but the vast majority of that output was consumed within the Soviet Empire. Things only started to get internationally interesting when the Soviet Union collapsed. So Soviet industry collapsed, no more internal demand for all this oil, so they started exporting. The first wave of post-Soviet exports, the Russians focused not simply on what they knew, but on what their infrastructure would allow. Piped exports to their former satellites, one of which was now a constituent part of reunited Germany. The DDR, of course, East Germany. Former DDR, the Neue Länder is what they call it in Germany. The second
new
wave...
land? That Germany refers to East Germany as the new land now?
The states in the East... After Germany was reunited, they were referred to as Neue Länder, the new states, basically.
Okay.
The first wave, the second wave expanded on what the Russians knew, thickening and extending those pipe links through Central Europe into Western Germany, Austria, and the Western Balkans, and Turkey. There's a lot of what we see going on today goes back to those original pipeline build-outs. The implementing wave 2, the Russians discovered that ports like Gdansk in Poland, Ventspils in Latvia, and Constanta in Romania could serve as offloading facilities for Russian crude, enabling it to sail onto customers far and wide. Phase 3 was about linking up and building out Russia's own ports to serve the same purpose. Primorsk near St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea and Novorossiysk and Tuapse on the Black Sea. During these first three phases, the other former Soviet states were hardly standing still. Now divorced from their former imperial master, all needed to establish their own income streams, preferably ones that were not beholden to Moscow. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan both courted any and all foreign investors, with BP and Exxon proving the most interested. The foreigners executed some of the most complex seismic drilling, processing, and infrastructure programs the energy world had ever seen, and began shipping crude out via whatever route possible. Some routes, I think that's where also that Kashagan falls into. Some routes tapped into legacy Soviet infrastructure, heading north and west to places like Ventspils or Novorossiysk. But as time ticked by, the flows were increasingly concentrated into a single pipe corridor that began at Baku, Azerbaijan, and ended at a supertanker port in the Mediterranean city of Ceyhan, Turkey. What all these options have in common is that they all flow in the general direction of Eurasia's common extremities. And since Europe was peaking demographically, there was little reason to expect European oil demand to increase ever again. Sure, the Russians were filling a larger and larger slice of the demand, but the market saturation was decreasing their pricing power. The Russians hated that. So in the fourth phase, the Russians started the long, expensive process of routing fresh pipe infrastructure east of the Pacific. So he talks about here about the big mess that is they basically drilling oil in Siberia.
And are we able to summarize it by essentially saying, A, it's way far out of the way of everything, and B, it's in permafrost? So
Exactly.
if
So
you can't turn it off, or else it'll break.
Yeah, well, you can only do drilling operations in the winter. It's like because in the summer it's too warm, so it's not a
Too
flat
muddy.
surface.
Yeah.
It turns into this muddy slush where you can't operate in. So,
Imagine having to live in Russia. God, it must suck.
the Russians are no slouches when it comes to oil work, but they were out of circulation from the 40s through 2000. The techs involved came a long way that time. Foreigners, most notably Supermajor BP and services from Halliburton and Schlumberger, are responsible for half-ish of contemporary Russia's output. Any broad-scale removal of Western firms from the mix would have catastrophic impacts upon oil production throughout the entire former Soviet space. The Ukraine war is stress testing that theory. So
right now. So yeah, because this book came out right before the Ukraine war.
Yeah, and
his predictions are coming true right now.
He made some additions after the Ukraine war.
Okay.
So I think this year the Ukraine war is stress testing that theory. That would have probably come after that started. For their part, the Azerbaijani and Kazakh projects are far and away the world's most technically exacting. Think Kashagan. Aside from the handful of folks in the world's super majors who designed these projects, no one on the planet can maintain them. So, like, a few people who will die one day, not too far distant future. They are the only ones who can maintain these.
So there's only a handful of super experts that know how to run this, and if a war happens and they can't get there, then the whole thing shuts off. Or if they die one day, the whole thing shuts off.
Then there's the issue of export routes. All of the broader region's oil flows first travel by pipe, in some cases for literally thousands of miles, before they reach either a customer or a discharge port. Pipes can't dodge. Anything that impedes a single inch of pipe shuts the whole thing down. In the order, that's fine and dandy. Post-order, not so much. So the order is the Americans patrolling the ocean. And by the way, that's kind of what the Chechen rebels did in the 1990s. They just started drilling Russian pipelines, drilling holes.
Well, that's happened with Nord Stream that blew up. I mean, not getting into who may have done it. It was done, and the oil stopped. Like it only touched one point, but it stopped all the oil.
About half the flows terminate in end users like Germany, while the other half must be loaded on tankers for sale. That's where things get extra dicey. In the Pacific, the Nakhodka port sits smack in the middle of Japanese, Chinese, and Korean spheres of influence. Any meaningful conflict involving any of the three, Nakhodka becomes either occupied or a crater. Out to the west, exports via the Black Sea ports of Novorossiysk and Tuapse are fully dependent upon sales through downtown Istanbul. So any hiccup with the Turks, blah, blah, blah. That's why they're talking so much with the Turks, obviously. Sailing farther north, anything out of Primorsk has to sail the Baltic Sea and the Skagerrak Strait, sailing by no fewer than 7 navally over-capable to their size countries that tend to nurse pathological fears and hatreds towards all things Russian, in addition to Germany, in addition to the UK.
Yeah, so this is all the the Norwegian, Sweden, Denmark, all these Latvia, whatever. They all control that area, and they have navies that are kind of outsized for what you would think for the size of their country, and so Russia has to get their oil through there. Here, I mean, just going back to the Afro-Eurasian thing, Russia, the biggest country on Earth, somehow has this awful geography. Where they can't access the fucking ocean. Right? It's either like in permafrost, or they got to go through the Dardanelles and the Strait of Gibraltar, or the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's just like, oh, this sucks. If you're in Russia. What you pulling up here? Oh, okay. We got some better maps.
Let's try to
maximize that. Yeah. Okay. So this is Russia turned on its side.
Yeah.
So north is to the right. That's the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah. Actually, this is not the Arctic Ocean. This is Arctic land. Actually, the Arctic Ocean starts here. So all of this is also Russia. You know.
Oh, so that's tundra. The blue is tundra. Is what we're seeing.
Yeah. So this green territory is all that Russia has as far as arable land, but the Russian territory itself it expands way beyond all of this.
And I've heard Peter Zeihan say there's two big issues with that green space in Russia. The first is you got like 3 months of growing season there because the rest of the time it's frozen. And then the other thing is because it's so interspersed, getting the produce out of there is a big freaking problem because all of the non-arable land in between. Like you got like these islands of arable land all over the place, which is, again, if you look at the Ukraine, why you might imagine that controlling the Ukraine would be beneficial to Russia because it's got a significant chunk of arable land into it.
Right.
But we're talking about oil.
And within more preferable climatic conditions. Yes. Like also all of Crimea, by the way, here.
Yes.
Arable, apparently. This was a tweet by Peter Zeihan, actually. One of my favorite Russia graphics, so you can familiar yourself, blah, blah, blah. Empty Russia.
Yeah, and then I've seen him show this where you could basically see that the population distribution lines up exactly with the green on that other map.
Yeah.
Because there's no way to live anywhere else.
Yeah, nobody wants to be out here. You can see much more population density here in Ukraine and Crimea. That's why these areas are so important for them, I guess.
Yeah, there are no good. I was just reading his tweet. There are no good barriers between populated zones to keep invaders at bay.
Yep.
So say the Mongols, or so prove the Mongols.
There's these gaps here. These are all the. This is why they're so interested in these areas here.
Yeah, these are all the choke points.
Baltic Sea. Yeah. Anyway, let's get
back to oil.
So, yeah, then he goes into what we just talked about, how permafrost, you can only drill in the winter, the Siberian winter, so it sounds like fun, right?
Yeah, that's like North Slope conditions in Alaska. Oh.
Right. So now the third important and final major source of global crude is North America.
Yep.
Of course, also Mexico is part of that as well. So that Mexico has been pumping out oil for quite a while, very reliably. And Mexico produces and uses about 2 million barrels per day. Up in the north, we have the Canadian oil sector that got its start in the 1950s, becoming globally significant in the 1970s. But it wasn't until the 80s that the province of Alberta started cracking the code on some seriously unconventional output. Traditionally, oil migrates through rock formations until it reaches an impermeable rock layer. For example, the crude might migrate through sandstone, but granite would stop it cold. Pressure then builds behind the impermeable layer. When a drill punches through the cap, the pressure and oil are released. Most of Alberta's oil is nothing like that. But most of it is just sand. So you have to,
the oil sands. Yep.
Big mass, and you have to process.
Centrifuge it. Yeah.
Canada produces far more than it could ever use. It consumes a similar amount to Mexico, but exports that much again. So about 2 million. So they produce about 4 million barrels per day. They consume 2 million, export 2 million. No matter how it is measured, okay, yeah, that's what we said. And then the continent's middle latitudes. The Americans have a lot going on. They have a legacy offshore sector in the Gulf of Mexico that didn't really get going until the 70s. There's still conventional crude trickling out of Pennsylvania and Texas in places that have been producing oil longer than any other spots on the planet. Even California was among the country's largest oil producers, and quite recently with one of the country's most prolific wells located in a mall in Wilshire Boulevard, while another is cleverly disguised as a synagogue. So it's
I was just thinking about that. They're in Los Angeles. There's
in
oil pumping in Los Angeles. Yeah.
Beverly Hills, and yes, I also when you drive into the city from the airport, you drive by oil fields in Los Angeles. There's these big devices. What do you call these things that keep moving like this.
Are they the derricks? I think is what they're called.
I guess so. Yeah, they keep. So yeah, taken together, the American conventional oil legacy remains substantial, still kicking out about 4 million barrels per day, a volume that compares favorably to Iran at its. So that's the legacy oil, right? Mm-hmm. Iran in its 70s height, and is about the same as the total output from Canada today. But the real story is the new stuff, America's shale oil sector. Back in the early 2000s, the world of oil got slammed by 4 simultaneous and unrelated events. First, the US subprime build was already getting out of hand, generating unhealthy levels of demand for all the things that go into home construction: lumber, concrete, copper, steel, and oil. Second, the Chinese boom. So here's, by the way, just a comment. There's some utility in the Austrian business cycle theory, I think, here.
Okay.
Just not in the way that people think, because the Austrian economists, they think that it's interest rate manipulation, but it's much more about lending standards. If the lending standards are lax and money is lent without the proper considerations, then you build up a whole bunch of stuff that otherwise people wouldn't have really been interested in building.
Well, I think more particularly, you're building up loans where they're probably not going to be able to pay them back. You're lending to people who aren't good credit risks.
Right. So these things shouldn't have been built because the people consuming them in the end, they didn't produce the equivalent. So this is kind of the idea of the business cycle, that people invest in projects that they otherwise wouldn't have invested in based on the profitability of the project. This is also, by the way, how China has financed its whole boom, and we're seeing ghost cities, these giant cities. So there's some value in understanding overinvestment, hyper-financialization, as Peter Zeihan calls it, lending without the proper considerations. And here it gets to, second, the Chinese boom was getting a touch insane. Price-insensitive demand drove up the price of all globally available commodities, oil included. Remember that? 2006, 2005, 2006, commodity prices went insane. Mm-hmm. We still haven't, remember when we had our call about how food shortages are coming? Everywhere, Time Magazine, this, everyone, everywhere was saying food shortages are coming. Presumably so they can sell us their bugs and worms and Bill Gates fake meat, exactly, and their vegan diets and whatnot. I just wanted to see, there's this wheat ETF that back then, when everyone was screaming food prices, I was saying I don't really see these food.
Oh, that's right.
I don't see any evidence for these food shortages. I mean, of course, the poor countries have food shortages, this and that, but just out of the ordinary food shortages, it seemed to be a very contrived talking point, and I just want to look that up. Actually, I'll share my screen so people don't get bored with my face. What was it called?
Oh no, BlackRock's planning to cut workers. How sad.
They've come down. Actually, they've come down precipitously since we last talked. You know, like there was this brief January 2022, February 2022. It went up from $7.30 to $11 approximately. This was when we had that discussion about the Russian war and its impact. Everyone talked about food shortages.
Right. So that's probably fear was probably driving that.
Right. And now we're back down.
And because I mean, even at the bottom, you'll see the light green, just the increase in activity. It's a massive increase in activity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a volume, trading volume. Yeah. That's, by the way, usually a sign of bullshit going on. When you have high volume and prices going up, that's oftentimes a sign of idiots buying, basically, large volume.
Corn
is a similar, I guess, situation, but it's also come down also. Corn has started going up since the lockdowns began, interestingly. Let's look at the soy boys. What are the soy boys doing here? Soybeans. The soy boys are gobbling up those soy lattes, so I guess that's why. Soy keeps going up. But still, I mean, if it was due to the war, I mean, it's been sort of, I guess, it's been pretty stable since then. So what's the big deal? I don't know.
Anyway, back to oil.
Back to, well, so the Chinese boom was getting a touch insane. Commodities, etc., and also the Chinese ghost cities and all that insanity that went on. And a lot of oil is used up in that stuff. A lot of steel, oil, all kinds of materials. Third, in 2002, a very unsuccessful coup in Venezuela led to a very successful political purge of the country's state oil firm, a purge that focused on the technocrats who produced the oil. The country's energy sector never recovered.
Yeah, so they shot all the people who knew how to produce the oil as political dissidents, basically.
Fourth, in 2003, the Americans invaded Iraq, taking all its oil output offline. Good job, Americans. Mm-hmm. The country didn't return to pre-war levels of output for 16 years. Between higher demand and lower supplies, oil prices steadily climbed from below $10 a barrel in 1998 to nearly $150 per barrel in 2008. When your work earns you $10, you tend to stick to the tried and true. When your work earns you $150, you can afford all kinds of things. So he goes into the shale revolution. So this, because shale oil costs about, if I remember correctly, he said somewhere, I think it costs something like, at the time at least, cost $90 per barrel. I don't know if they improved that now. But so if the oil price is $150 per barrel, then now it pays to invest and expand into that field.
Right.
In essence, shale operators drill down as per normal, but when they reach petroleum-rich rock strata, they take a sharp turn drilling horizontally along the entire layer. Then they pump water and sand at high pressure into the formation. Since liquids do not compress, the rock cracks apart from within, freeing untold trillions of tiny pockets of oil and natural gas that would otherwise be far too small to harvest with conventional drilling. Voila, blah, blah, blah.
And then we have oil. Boom.
We have oil. At the dawn of the shale era in 2005, these horizontal wells were only 600 feet long per drilling platform and only produced a few dozen barrels of oil per day. As of 2022, many of the newer laterals are in excess of 2 miles, with many of the wells supporting a veritable tree of branches of sub-laterals in excess of a mile-long reach, all connecting to the same vertical pipe. With improvements in everything from water management to drilling apparatuses to data processing to seismic imaging to pump power, it is now common to have individual wells kick out in excess of 5,000 barrels of oil a day, a figure that puts individual American shale well on par with some of the most prolific oil wells in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. That puts individual American shale wells, so an individual well puts them on par with big oil fields in Iraq and Saudi Arabia.
Right, and this is virgin, right? This isn't like going back to an old well and digging it back up again. This is going to an area that nobody ever touched because we couldn't utilize the resource.
No.
And I've seen Peter do presentations looking at Texas, and he's just like, there's just these massive fields that no one's ever done anything with that we could now exploit.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So collectively, these changes have added some 10 million barrels per day, making the United States the largest producer of oil in the world. So this has only happened very recently. While simultaneously, so, remember peak oil and all that stuff?
Oh, yeah, back in the 70s.
Paul Ehrlich and all these assholes. Does anyone still care what they said? No, because it was nonsense. United States, making the United States, by the way, we keep finding more and more oil, right? The story is always, the oil companies like to proliferate the story about how, oh, we're running out of oil, it's rare. But the amount of oil wells and oil deposits that we discover just keeps growing and growing.
Well, and I want to emphasize that the evidence that this stuff is fossil fuel is pretty scant. I'm not saying it's nonsense, but I'm just saying, like, okay, you found some bones of dinosaurs in tar fields. That doesn't mean that the tar fields are made out of dinosaurs. Okay? You got to give me a little more evidence to back up the theory than just taking that and running, right? Because if there is something to the effect that, the Earth generates it, or maybe there's bacteria way down there that generate it, or something, we don't know. These are all hypotheses, that there's no reason to slow it down. It's not. It's in that case, it's not a rare resource, and we can just pump it like crazy. Who cares?
Yeah. So, and of course, the fact that Wikipedia calls this theory a fringe science.
Oh, then we know it's true.
Right. Because otherwise, they wouldn't do that, right? They would say, "Here's a theory," and make up your own mind. But no, Wikipedia has to inject their stupid ass opinions. So we know that it's an agenda that they're trying to defend, because that's what people want you to believe, that we're going to run out of oil one day. Yep. Chiefly the oil companies. I mean, why would they not want people to believe that?
Right, because then the price can go up.
There's an article on Forbes as well, Endless Oil, from a while ago.
Anyway, people can check that out.
And for what it's worth, it happens to be confirmed by the evidence we find in reality, because deposits that we are aware of just keep growing and growing. So
well, and then I mean the BP spill. Remember that in the Gulf of Mexico? They drilled miles down. Are you going to tell me that dinosaurs died and made it miles down? Miles into the crust of the earth? Like, what? Did these dinosaurs just like voluntarily go, okay, here's the abyss that goes down to the center of the earth. We all need to jump in at the same time in order. I mean, like, how the hell did they get down there? Oh.
Yeah, that was a good old oil spill back then.
Yes. Please continue.
So the shale era, basically, these changes have added some 10 million barrels per day, making the U.S. the largest oil producer in the world, while simultaneously enabling it to achieve net oil independence. Now there are a veritable forest of yes buts in that statement, ranging from complications as regards crude quality, natural gas infrastructure, and climate change.
Ha 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 ha.
And we will get to them all, but the central takeaway is easily graspable. The world's energy map is radically different in 2022 compared to how it looked just 15 years ago, because the world's largest importer has become a net exporter. The shale revolution has changed the strategic math that underpins the global energy sector, and with it globalization as a whole. Put very simply and very directly, both production and exports from both the Persian Gulf and the former Soviet space are dependent upon both America's global security architecture and the ability of foreign technicians to access both regions. In contrast, production within North America is dependent upon neither.
Another reason why it's great to be here.
Exactly. It's a good spot. So he talks about the different risks that could cause this whole market to experience blows at any point in time, right? As he says, the U.S. has pulled its forces, land-based and naval, out of the Persian Gulf, leaving it to the Iranians and Saudis to argue over who's really in charge. At risk, 26.5 million barrels per day. India reacts to rising oil prices by seizing tankers bound for East Asia. So he's saying this is a hypothetical scenario, right? It can happen. No East Asian power has the capacity to project naval force to the Persian Gulf without active Indian complicity. At risk, 21 million barrels per day. Export flows from Hormuz, plus another 1.5 million from Nigeria and Angola that head to Asia. Egypt restricts cargo transiting the Suez, again at risk, 4.25 million barrels of export flows, about 60% of which is transshipped via canal bypass pipelines, and so could prove vulnerable to internal Egyptian political violence. In the absence of American naval power, piracy blooms off the coasts of West and East Africa, at risk 3.5 million barrels. The Russians have very different views from the Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, Poles, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Danes as to how regional security issues should be resolved. At risk 2 million barrels per day of Russian export flows via the Baltic, and 2 million barrels per day of Norwegian oil production. Relations between the major suppliers of oil expertise, the UK and the US, and the Russian tank, and the Russians tank, perhaps because there's a war. At risk 5 million barrels of Russian oil production and another 1 million from Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Islamist-related security in Saudi Arabia, 2 million barrels of Iraqi oil, 6 million in Saudi. Internal politics of West and Central African nations, at risk 2 million barrels per day from Nigeria, another 1.5 million from other producers in the region. Without Russia and China bonding over their hatred for the US, oil shipments from the former to the latter are hardly sacrosanct. The two nearly nuked each other in the late 1960s. Actually, I didn't know that. Over a territorial dispute, both peoples are impressively racist towards one another. And if Russia never uses energy leverage over China, well, then China would be the only country the Russians haven't played that card with. At risk, roughly 1.8 million and another 200,000 per day of Central Asian shipments. Even this list assumes that the US will take a fully hands-off approach to the world instead of being perhaps a disruptor. Americans love levying sanctions. So he talks about that's another risk, right? Americans levying sanctions that could also, just
well, and
put
then,
a nice wrench in all of this.
Just to describe this from a 30,000-foot view, is that all the oil distribution in Afro-Eurasia looks like it's about to just get completely screwed up, whereas the oil distribution here in North America, it's not only not screwed up, it's getting better.
Right. So there's a map, there's a chart here where he talks about the major regions of oil supply in the world are basically the Persian Gulf with 30 million barrels per day, the former Soviet Union with 15 million, NAFTA with 25 million, and then others such as Brazil, Nigeria, Angola, India, Indonesia, Egypt, Malaysia, Australia, another 43 million barrels per day. And the consumption, Europe consumes about 15 million. You notice how Europe was nowhere in this list of producers, right? Mm-hmm. Europe needs to import almost all its oil, except for Norway, maybe, which I think
and Romania.
Right, and I think Norway uses a lot of it for their own country, and also they put some of it in a fund for their retirees. Other countries consume 44 million. NAFTA consumes about 24 million, which is less than it produces. And Northeast Asia about 20 million. And Northeast Asia doesn't produce anything either, other than actually Northeast Asia doesn't have any oil production. And he says here this will get really scary. Japan is the only power with a long-reach navy. I didn't know. Don't know if it helps to hold this up here, but that's.
Are each of those a relative size of oil production within certain spheres?
Yeah. So on the one side is supply, right?
Uh-huh.
On the other is demand. So the left is supply, and then these are the amounts of oil. So the big circles are the entire region, and then it tells you what the different constituent countries of the respective region are. Mm-hmm. Either a Persian Gulf at the top on the left, supply. FSU is former Soviet Union, NAFTA, other. And then on the right is the consumers of oil, which is Europe, others, NAFTA and Northeast Asia. Just by the by, he says Japan has the second largest long-reach, its second most powerful long-reach navy in the world, which I wasn't
was a
aware
shocker
of.
to me, for sure.
Wow. I mean, they certainly haven't. They've shown restraint in deploying that navy so far, I think.
Well, I had thought that the Constitution of Japan, since World War II, had disallowed them to do such a thing, but apparently the Japanese are masters at manipulating names. So it's not a military; it's a defense strategy or something like that, right? They're really, really good at that sort of thing, and I guess they've done it so well that they've actually created the second strongest navy on Earth.
Well, also I think under Abe they have remilitarized quite a bit, so there may be some recent trends involved in that. He talks about there's more to oil than oil in the next chapter. He talks about the inelasticity of oil, so Other products, you know, if the demand changes by 1%, the price changes by 1%. With the oil, it's more like the supply changes by 1% and the price will change by 75%, something like that. Just to give you a general idea of how quickly this can cause disruptions. So that's the inelasticity. Then there's the disruptability, right? There's all these giant pipelines
that you can flick and screw them up. Yeah.
Right. And inseparability. So one of the many transformative impacts of the order was the combining of the entire world into a single market. So, you know, it's either a single market or not. And if it's not, it's like very different. Look, the market.
Well, and if it's not the single market, these pipelines and shipping lanes shut down.
Yeah. So, so he says that the world will become more regionalized. There will be different regions with their own trade agreements. There will be a few exceptions which fall into two general categories. First are those proto-empires that are able to militarily command shipments out of specific nearby production areas. Such interjections will not typically be clean, easy, or welcomed by the oil producers, but they will happen nonetheless. The second set of exceptions involves the major powers who produce the crude they need internally and so can block exports with a few pen flicks or switch flips.
Like us.
Yeah.
In the United States.
In both types of regional systems, the economics of oil will echo models established in the pre-order world, so pre-1945, in other words. Each system will have its own supply and demand mechanics. So remember how he talked about how the oil market used to be more diverse? It wasn't the global market.
Like the price over here might be this, but the price over there might be that. Because
there's the French,
yeah.
You have the French system, you have the UK system, and you had the American system.
Yeah.
Each system will have its own supply and demand mechanics, its own security risk premiums, its own crude grade patterns, and above all, its own pricing logic. The easiest of these pockets to predict is the US. Most conventional oil wells take years of work to bring online, but shale wells only need a few weeks. Expect any price spikes in the soon-to-be sequestered American market to be easily ameliorated with a fairly even-keeled price structure topping out at roughly $70 per barrel. Canada will be brought along for the ride, since all meaningful Canadian export infrastructure terminates in US territory. A close second is Russia. While Russian civilian technological acumen has all but collapsed since the Cold War's end, so too has Russian industrial capacity. The end result has freed up 5 million barrels of oil and around 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas for daily export. The Russians have never been slaves to modern capitalistic norms, and the future will be no exception. I have exceedingly high confidence that in time Russian shortages in capital, labor, and technical command will erode away all of those exports. The key words here, however, are in time. Under any scenario that doesn't involve mushroom clouds or extreme civil breakdown, the Russians will have more than sufficient energy for their own needs, at least until the early 2040s. And since Russia will in essence be a closed system, internal energy prices will be precisely what the Kremlin decrees them to be. Argentina is likely to experience an oil system not all that different from the US. This comes out of left field. It's like,
we haven't talked about Argentina at all, or even South America, other than Venezuela at this point.
Yeah, it's not even listed under others.
So Argentina has oil, okay.
Difference for that not different from the US, despite some wildly creative approaches to economic management. Argentina already has the world's second most advanced shale sector, as well as the infrastructure necessary to bring local shale output to its population centers. France and Turkey also look fairly good. Both are proximate. This is an ongoing theme in his analysis. France is actually in a pretty good position, according to Peter Zeihan.
So is Turkey, yes.
France and Turkey look fairly good. Both are proximate to regional energy producers, Algeria and Libya for France, Azerbaijan and Iraq for Turkey, as well as sporting the global technical skills required to make those oil patches work. That said, securing said output will require a neo-colonial approach to their regions, and that will generate drama. The UK, India, and Japan are up next. All need to venture out, but have naval forces more or less right-sized to reach potential sources. In this, the Brits have the easiest jaunts to make. Norway provides local supplies, while the British Navy can easily reach West Africa for the balance. The Indians look good too. The Persian Gulf is only a short hop away. And they have friendly relations with Iran, by the way. Japan gets a bit dicey. Sure, Japan sports the world's second most powerful long-reach navy, but the Persian Gulf oil fields are daunting and 7,000 miles away. Of the countries that can secure their needs, it is Japan that will face the greatest risk of disruptions, shortages, and high prices. Outside of this short list of states, the picture darkens in every conceivable way. Without the supply redundancy and variety that has dominated the post-1945 world, every single shipment interruption spells immediate price explosions. Even worse, many of the world's oil suppliers are not in what I'd call particularly stable areas. I'm looking at you, Iran and Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, South Sudan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Nigeria, and Egypt. Should a field become damaged, either by militancy, war, incompetency, or lack of maintenance, it doesn't simply go offline, it goes offline for years. Expect prices to be wildly erratic, dropping below $150 a barrel only on painfully rare occasions, assuming supplies can be sourced at all. And then he talks about the backup is much of a backup. He talks about the other countries, there's not much coming out of those countries. Colombia, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago. Well, so these three, they're not huge producers, but reasonably stable ones. In a post-order world, the Americans will establish security cordon around the entire hemisphere to keep the Eurasian powers from dabbling. So he says that the Americans will focus their energies on the Western hemisphere of the Western world.
Makes sense. I mean, again, looking at the geography where Afro-Eurasia goes this way with 1 million choke points, and North and South America go this way with these huge, infinite access to the seas. It's just a totally different world.
Exactly. And he says Brazil is a bit more complicated. Most of Brazil's production is offshore. Large-scale Brazilian output sufficient to generate large exports, a minimum of 2 decades and hundreds of $billions of investment away. Venezuela used to matter, but most of Venezuela's oil used to go to the US, but American refiners have given up on Venezuela, ever returning to the market. If Venezuela is to contribute to global oil supply, somebody will need to deploy forces to the country and impose security. Arrest the fallen, bring in billions of dollars of supplies to support the population, and tens of billions to overhaul the energy infrastructure, all while convincing the Americans that they won't try anything cute. Impossible? No, but at a minimum, it would be a 3-decade reconstruction project. Candidates are the US or Colombia, actually, which Colombia makes sense. Colombia is right there, right next door.
We'll trade you some of our cocaine for that oil.
They share a common history. The two countries used to be, they almost became one country. That's why also their flags look very similar. And Colombia has, I think, accepted by far the largest number of Venezuelan refugees. I mean,
I've heard that too, yeah.
In the millions. I don't know, 5 million or something like that, or more even. I don't know. The Western African states of Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola have always been sketchy operating environments for foreign oil firms. It's not a security issue. In Southeast Asia, the countries of Australia, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam are all reasonable producers. However, in recent decades, these countries have experienced sufficient economic growth that rising regional oil demand has gobbled up nearly all available regional supply. Remember, he's pretty bullish on Indonesia, actually. If it's, given certain favorable factors, they may do pretty well. The North Sea is Europe's only significant remaining production zone, with the vast bulk of the output lying in the sea's Norwegian sector. The Norwegians enjoy excellent relations with their cultural cousins in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, as well as their primary maritime neighbor, the UK. To be perfectly blunt, this entire roster of countries is likely to find themselves on opposite sides of the table from both the French and Germans moving forward, and they are already on the opposite sides of barbed wire from Russians. In order to preserve themselves, this collective is all but certain to take joint action to prevent North sea energy from going anywhere except to the members of their group.
So,
That's great.
which is smaller than the European Union, I would point out, right?
No,
So this is another rift occurring within the European Union.
Yeah, and they have their own. They already have the building stones, I guess, for their own economic region. They have,
Building blocks, you mean?
Building blocks. Yeah, sorry, fob.
Nima translating from German there.
Yeah, I'm such a fob sometimes. No,
What's
the
a fob?
Nordic, fresh off the boat.
Oh, okay. All right.
Nordic Alliance, that's what it's called. Yeah, they actually have an alliance where their parliaments and their members meet. The Nordic Defense Cooperation is a collaboration among the Nordic countries, area of defense. Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. So I think Russia was actually a member of this. It must have been fairly recently that they exited it. But yeah, they have. I don't know if this is the one I'm looking for, but I think it was called Nordic Alliance, Nordic Council. That's what I was looking for. That's what I was looking for. So Nordic Alliance: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Faroe Islands, Greenland, and this place, Åland, whatever.
Yes. So this area is looking like it's going to regionalize, at least from the oil production standpoint and consumption standpoint.
They do their own thing. I mean, they have their own thing going on up there, and they're not necessarily interested in giving up the access to their oil. Algeria has been a major producer for decades, and its output has helped mitigate some of the pricing chaos in the Persian Gulf. So yeah, Algeria will probably be a good source for France, and Libya will probably be sort of
Unknown.
Well, it will be approached by Italy.
Yeah.
For geographic and historical reasons. Italy has been a little more involved in Libya. There's more to oil than oil. He talks more about blah blah blah.
Keep in mind, Nima, we're broaching an hour and a half here.
Yeah.
How much left is in this chapter?
There's even more to oil than oil. It's the next subchapter. So he talks about how also the U.S. has the advantage that natural gas in the U.S. is produced very conveniently alongside the oil drilling. I don't know if you're familiar.
It's a byproduct. Right.
Byproduct.
Yeah. I don't know how recent this is, but Peter has mentioned on videos that they give it away for free because normally they would just burn it.
Yeah.
Kind of like what I said with gasoline back in the day.
For some reason, that's a peculiar thing about the U.S. Drilling operations. It seems to be very easy in the U.S. to obtain natural gas just as a byproduct, while in other locations, it's apparently not that easy. Then he goes into the chapter called Climate Change.
For the sake of brevity, can we save that for a future call? Or for future show, excuse me.
Sure, we can do that. Oh, in the United States, gas is frequently a byproduct of its shale sector's oil efforts. So it's because of the shale, I guess. In particular, when you do shale oil drilling, gas.
You're releasing all those pockets where the gas is trapped. Yeah.
The Americans often have to flare this stuff because they cannot build out their distribution infrastructure fast enough to capture it all.
Flare means burning it, by the way.
Once it is captured, it's typically sold into the system at near zero, and even adding and processing and transport costs. Most American end users get access at something less than 1/4 of the cost of the rest of the world. So I'm in Florida, and I recently looked it up. I think Florida runs on about 70% natural gas, and I think similar numbers probably apply in other parts of this country.
Just as a side note, I remember when I worked at that oil refinery. So natural gas is methane, just so everyone's clear, which is C1. If you know anything about chemistry, it's the most simple hydrocarbon that there is. There is some natural gas in crude oil, by the way, because it dissolves in the crude oil, and when you distill it, it's the stuff that comes off at the top. They didn't sell it where I worked. They just sent that to the boilers and just burned it for fuel immediately, and anything that was left over, they sent it and they flared it off, just like Nima was saying. There it is, C4, like I just said, which is not stinky as much as the stereotype goes. Typically, the stink when it comes from something like cows is from sulfur molecules, not methane itself. Methane is supposedly odorless.
Right.
Relevant facts to this discussion, I guess.
Yeah, and he also goes into what you were saying earlier, how much oil is actually used for other purposes beyond transportation. So we have cars, trucks, aviation, maritime makes up about 55% or so, and marine and rail and waterways. And then there's about 40%, a little more than 40% used for what you said, petrochemicals, lubricants, industry.
That was when I forgot lubricants. Thank you.
Buildings, like you said, tar, I guess, is probably part of that. Yeah, I mean, I guess this would be a good follow-up or just close on it. It's not that much left anymore. I don't know. I mean,
okay.
It talks about climate change. It talks about the diversity of climate in different parts of the world. When the climate changes, he actually really literally talks about the changing climate to some extent, right? So, which is a little different from a CO2 emission.
From the CO2 crap, yeah.
From the CO2 hypothesis. But just as different gases have different heat trapping and light reflecting characteristics, so do different climates and land covers and latitudes and altitudes. We're not looking at an even heating, but instead an extremely uneven heating that has more of an impact on land versus water, on the Arctic versus tropics, on cities versus forests. That affects not only local temperatures, but regional wind patterns and global ocean currents. Such inconsistency does far more than add one more variable to the mix of latitude, elevation, humidity, temperature, soil composition, surface angle, and so on that enables me to read the planet. The entire map of everything is changing. Second, so he says here, no matter what happens politically or technologically, we are nowhere near being done with oil. The dominant environmental concern with all things oil has been about carbon dioxide emissions. But technologies like the internal combustion engine that burn oil products to produce those emissions are hardly the only things that use oil. Oil is also the base material for the bulk of the world's petrochemical needs. That sector is not a rounding error. So this is what I was just saying, right? Oil is used for other things as well, and it's indispensable to those things. Green tech does not make a country immune to geopolitics. It just shifts the view. Climate, temperature, land cover, resource location, distance, and maritime choke points are hardly the only geopolitical factors. So are latitude, elevation, humidity, temperature, surface angle, wind speed, wind reliability, solar radiation, and seasonal weather variation. So he goes into how solar and wind energy may work in very specific regions around the world. He himself actually has a solar panel. He had one in Austin that became paid for itself after 7 years or so. So he recovered his investment after 7 years in among the most beneficial solar conditions.
And to that point, I just want to say the most beneficial solar conditions aren't just that it's sunny all the time. It's that it's in an area where people need air conditioning, because you need the air conditioning during the day when it's sunny. The energy is available to use for the air conditioning, as opposed to places where it's cold and there's not a lot of sun. You need heat and you need it at night when there's no sun.
Right. And then he later on he goes into the ability to store all this in a battery, and he talks about the insanity of that proposition based on the technology we have available, even just to power the existing electrical grid. But then on top of that, to run cars on electricity, run everything on electricity, how impossible that is given current technologies. Fourth is the issue of density. So density, he talks about how, a solar panel requires a lot of space. Fossil fuels are so concentrated that they're literally energy in physical form. In contrast, all green techs require space. Solar is the worst of the bunch. It is roughly 1,000 times less dense than systems powered by more conventional means. Consider America's megalopolis, the line of densely packed cities from Boston in the north to the greater DC area in the south. Collectively, the coastal cities of this line comprise roughly 1/3 of the American population on a tiny footprint. So the impossibility of the unavailability of enough space to use solar to power this region.
Yeah, right. Because you stuck all your solar farms in Texas, you can't get it to where all the people are living on the northeast / east coast.
And then also the technology is very unreliable, right? Like you said, wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine, except for very specific regions. Even if fifth point, even if solar and wind were equivalent technologies to oil, natural gas, and coal in terms of reliability, decarbonizing the grid would remain a mammoth task. Currently, 38% of global power is carbon-free, suggesting we'd only need to roughly triple the good slice to displace the bad. Wrong. Hydropower has already used all available appropriate geographics globally. Nuclear would first need a hell of a PR campaign to sufficiently improve its image. If only solar and wind are doing the lifting, they would need a 9-fold build-out to fully displace fossil fuels. Sixth, even in the geographies where green tech works well, it is at best only a partial patch. Green tech only generates electricity. Wind and solar might theoretically be able to replace coal in some specific locations, but electricity of any type is not compatible with existing infrastructure and vehicles that use oil-derived liquid fuels. Such restriction naturally leads to discussion of electric vehicles as a wholesale replacement for those powered by internal combustion engines. Such is far more difficult than it sounds. The entirety of the global electricity sector generates roughly as much power as liquid transport fuels. Run the math. Switching all transport from internal combustion to electric would necessitate a doubling of humanity's capacity to generate electricity. Again, hydro and nuclear couldn't help. So that 9-fold increase in solar and wind is now a 20-fold increase. Nor are you even remotely done. You now need absolutely massive transmission capacity to link the locations where wind and solar systems can generate power to where that power would ultimately be consumed. In the case of Europe and China, those power lines have to jump continents. You're also assuming minor little details break your way, such as the wind always blowing, or the sun never setting, or there never being hiccups in transmitting power from the Libyan desert to Berlin, or the outback to Beijing. More likely, EVs with today's technology will work only if we double down on the very energy resources that environmentalists say we're trying to cut out of the system. In my not-so-humble opinion, we need to tackle first things first. We need to green the grid before we expand it. And unfortunately, the pace of that effort is painfully slow. From 2014, when the solar boom began, until 2020, solar has only increased to become 1.5% of total energy use.
Well, and then don't forget, just the fact that it's creating energy, you got to use it as you create it, as we just mentioned. So there's the baseline energy that coal or nuclear can, or even hydroelectric can supplant, which is to say, okay, regardless of what's going on with the weather or what time of day it is, we could produce this energy, which acts as the baseline. And the wind and the solar, because they're erratic, they need to be on top of that, because when the energy demand goes up, they have to turn the crank, or turn the dial and turn up the energy production, and you can't do that with the solar and the wind. You just get whatever the hell you get.
Right. So here he shows total global energy production. The big slice here is conventional, and this little slice here is none of so-called fossil fuels. But out of that, as we discussed, we have a large part is hydro, which has already exhausted, which we've already exhausted. Then there's nuclear, which is comes with regulatory and
PR problems.
PR problems, and people don't really like to be at the receiving end of nuclear waste for some weird reason. So part of what makes the modern world work is on-demand electricity, like you said. So this would not, this would have to be available on demand. Like the existing grid is incredibly good at this. Part of what makes dispatchability so attractive is that there are peaks and troughs in normal electricity demand. Okay, so usually peak electricity demand is between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. with higher demand rates in the winter. However, peak solar supply is between 11 and 3 p.m. exactly outside that hours, and definitely not in the winter, right? So solar is mostly available when we least need it.
Except if you're in a hot place that needs air conditioning.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
And that's before considering that the same panel will generate different amounts of power based on location. My panels in the highlands of Colorado would spit out less than 1/5 of the power in the doldrums of Toronto. No amount of money enables us to ignore this little geographic problem. Unlike coal or natural gas, which can be pre-positioned, the wind blows where the wind blows and the sun shines where the sun shines. Any green tech generated electricity must then be wired to where it can be used. This is also not free and often results in the doubling and more of the cost of the delivered power. He goes here into... he also talks about how California cheats, right? California claims that they use a very high percentage of renewable energies, but they also import fossil fuel energies, and it doesn't appear on their calculation.
Oh, because it's not created internally, it's imported, and they just don't put it in the math.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
That sounds very Californian to me.
Yeah. I think Germany has always done something like that. Germany has imported a lot from nuclear energy countries such as Sweden and France, if I'm not mistaken. And then they present the numbers. Hey, look at us. We produce so and so much with solar and wind. Somewhere here he talks about... Yeah, so this is interesting here. Assuming that the technological improvements in the world of batteries that have unfolded since 1990 continue into 2026, the cost of a 4-hour lithium grid storage system, so the cost of a system that gives us 4 hours of buffer, right? So creating the battery system to store the solar and wind energy would cost about $240 per megawatt hour of capacity, or 6 times that of the standard combined cycle natural gas plant, which is currently the most common electricity generating asset. That's just for the battery, okay? That's not for the solar panels, for the upfront investment. Just for the battery, $250 an hour already. So anyone interested? Anyone
Yeah,
wanna...
I'll throw my investment money up right away on that.
As of 2021, the US had 1,100 gigawatts of installed electricity generation capacity, but only 23 gigawatts of electricity storage. Roughly 70% of the 23 gigawatts is something called pumped storage, in essence using excess generated power to pump water uphill and then allowing that water to flow down a water course to power a generator as needed. Most of the other 30% is some sort of storage capacity located in people's homes. Only 0.73 gigawatts of storage is actually in the form of batteries. The American state that is most committed to the ideology of a green future is California. The state as a whole has but enough total storage, not battery storage, total storage for 1 minute of power. LA, the American metropolitan area, with the most aggressive plan for installing grid storage, doesn't anticipate reaching 1 hour of capacity until 2024. Remember that's 1 hour for LA's current electricity, okay? That's not for...
No growth. That's assuming no growth. Yeah.
Well, that's not for the grandiose plans they have for only EV vehicles at one point, 2020, 2035, all cars, which they have now made a law. And they will...
Washington State just did it.
And they will. He talked about this on Joe Rogan's podcast. They will walk those laws back when the time comes.
Yeah.
There's going to be new administration in place. They're going to come up with excuses and reasons. Eighth, there's a little discussed financial issue that might soon make the entire discussion moot. In places with good solar wind resources, most current price assessments suggest that the combined lifetime cost of fuel, maintenance, and installation for green tech versus conventional is more or less equal. From the financial point of view, the primary difference is when capital must be committed. About 1/5 of the total cost. So basically, the way these solar and wind projects are financed is everything is upfront. The entire cost is upfront, and
you reap your benefits over years after that.
Right, and then it's basically, he says it's free, but it's not even necessarily free because you have to maintain the solar panels and you have to fix the turbines and all that stuff. But, you know, I guess maybe if you run the math, compared to oil, the upfront investment with so-called fossil fuels is much lower, and you pay it over time. So it's much. And he talks about in the capital-starved world of the future, this may be an issue. So, capital-rich world of the order, it's fine. Capital-starved, where it's less people investing, also less foreign investment, obviously. Right? There's less interaction between the different countries. It's going to be more protectionism, etc. There's going to be less opportunity to attract foreign investment. So the option A for this is far worse than it sounds from the point of view of greenhouse gas emissions, because the vast majority of these locations will not be able to retain access to internationally traded oil and natural gas. If they cannot source oil or natural gas and their geographics do not enable sufficient use of solar and wind, they will have a simple decision to make. Option A is to go without electricity, to deindustrialize, to decivilize. Option B, to use that one fuel source that nearly all countries have locally, coal. Many particularly unlucky people will be stuck with something called lignite, or barely qualifies as coal fuel, that is typically 1/5 water by weight and is by far the least efficient and dirtiest fuel in use today. Germany already today uses lignite as its primary power input fuel because green tech is so woefully unapplicable to the German geography, and yet the Germans, for environmental and I would say ideological reasons, have shut down most of their other power generation options. Germans, not as smart as you might think. So
sounds like a good commercial.
Right, so this is also what happened now that Germany has realized that it's not so easy to get natural gas when they piss off the Russians. They have gone back to coal under a green government, a green administration that has touted these plans of
That's right.
decarbonizing. They now had to go back to and ramp up the dirtiest fuel source in use today.
I have a funny story. So
congratulations, Germany.
When I was
government.
living in Austria, one of the friend families, like I've got friends with the whole family, was a family of engineers. And while I was over there, Wolfgang, the paterfamilias of the family, pulls out this book and he starts showing me that I think it was after World War II, when Germany and Austria were just bombed to smithereens, they didn't have anything. They were literally making cars that ran off of carbon monoxide from burning wood. So you would burn wood in this compartment that would generate the carbon monoxide that would go to another compartment, and then you'd burn the carbon monoxide in order to make the car go. So I wonder if Germany is going to be opening those books back up again here pretty soon. Be like, okay, let's chop down some trees so the car can go 5 miles today or something.
Yeah. Locations facing the greatest shortages are those major consumers at the very end of those vulnerable supply lines. Northeast Asia and Central Europe, with Germany, Korea, and China by far facing the greatest threats, as none have proximate oil or natural gas sourcing, nor the military capacity to venture out to secure someone else's. There will be electricity problems, which the Germans have seen that as well. In the UK, I believe, they've also had incredibly expensive electricity prices over the winter. All three use a mix of nuclear, natural gas, and coal for the vast bulk of their electricity needs, all based on imported fuel. Of these, China is by far the most vulnerable. 3 decades of growth has strained the country's electricity system. Country has no spare capacity. It runs all of its power generation flat out, regardless of the input fuel. So any input shortage would at a minimum lead to large-scale rotating blackouts. It's already happened. So that's what China did during the lockdowns, during the COVID scam. Countries like the UK, France, Japan, and India do have the military wherewithal and geographic position that will enable them to go out and secure resources themselves, but all will face a price environment of terrifying proportions. The ironic bottom line is that the US is one of only a handful of countries that not only will not face a protracted energy crisis, but can also attempt oil and natural gas substitutes at scale. So the US is actually best positioned to use these lofty green among the best positioned to utilize these green technologies.
And we're the ones who need them the least because we have so much frickin' oil.
Right. So the southeastern U.S. has a lot of sun, and the Great Plains have a lot of consistent wind, and Australia is very suitable for solar as well. And then patches in the North Sea apparently have some consistent sun supply. And so for all these topics we've addressed so far, transport, finance, and energy, the United States is the lucky country. That luck is deep-rooted in geography, which means it can be applied to other situations as well. For if you think the Americans have made it on these first three topics, just wait until you see the impact of the Americans' luck upon the next three. And the next chapter, he gets into industrial materials, which we will cover now. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, let's kind of look at this in from a, again, 30,000-foot view. It's for you and me, and maybe the people listening who like to listen to us, this isn't really anything new. It kind of confirms everything that we said, that, like, yeah, oil is pretty freaking important, and most of this green technology is not capable of doing anything near what it says. But it's, I mean, on one hand, it's good to hear that at some point, you know, the demands of reality are going to start walking this green crap backwards, because it's just, you know, the people are going to decide between dying and having energy. And I think even the people who are like, yeah, let's reduce the human population, when it comes to their turn, they're going to be like, no.
Oh, no,
drill the oil. Yeah.
And you see this more and more, this climate, this mental illness of fetishizing the changes in weather and the desire to stop the weather from changing.
Yeah.
Is now fading into the background. You can see it in the public discussion. When Zeihan was on Joe Rogan the other day, he actually called it a religion. He literally said, it's a new religion. And Joe Rogan, who used to be a believer in the hypothesis of catastrophic man-made climate change, I remember we had Jordan Peterson on, and he kind of started drilling him on it, because Jordan Peterson doesn't believe it. And now Joe Rogan, when on this call with Zeihan, he sounded much more
converted.
Well, he sounded not just skeptical. He realized that it's a lot of baloney, a lot of bullshit. And Zeihan called it a religion. So
that's a good sign. That makes me feel better about Zeihan.
This is something that's been going on. This is a long-term thing. This scam has been so well funded and orchestrated by the UN and the mega corporations that fund and make up the UN, and the media corporations that toe that line. It's going to take some time for it to fall apart and, you know, go crawl back into the hole where it's come from, never to return. Probably they've come up with a new scam at one point, and they always do, right? We've seen the Kufid, we've seen this, but it's a promising development.
It is. And, I mean, the terrifying and promising development of the fact that the whole Eastern Hemisphere's oil situation is about to come down like a house of cards, while simultaneously the oil situation on the Western Hemisphere, particularly, you know, Canada, United States, and Mexico, looks pretty freaking good. So it's good to know that, because, again, there was once upon a time I could have made a decision to live in Europe, and holy shit, am I glad I didn't make that decision, Nima. And I'm glad you came here instead of staying there.
Yeah. No, I'm very happy.
As pretty as it is there, it's about to get scary. Anyway, Nima, I really need to wrap this up, because I do have another thing I got to jump on here. Was there any last general comment that you wanted to make on the stuff that we just went over?
No, I think we've exhausted it. We've beaten this horse to death sufficiently.
Excellent. Okay. Well, in that case, this has been Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irida TV. Head over to irida.tv to find our social media of your choice. Please take some time to like, subscribe, and share this stuff because we have never asked you for any money. So please help us out a little bit by spreading us around. So thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.